the middle of a violent Colorado blizzard, two 5-year-old twin girls knocked on a millionaire's door, shivering and terrified. "Please, don't send us away," one whispered. What he discovered next would spark a courtroom battle, expose a cruel secret, and turn one lonely house into the only safe home they had left. The storm did not arrive like weather. It arrived like punishment. Snow slashed across the mountain road in furious white sheets, hurling itself against the iron gates of Cade Mercer's estate, as if it meant to tear the whole hill apart. High above Aspen Ridge, the mansion stood alone in the dark, all stone glass, and silence, its warm golden windows glowing against the brutal Colorado night. Inside, everything was polished, ordered, controlled. The kind of house built by a man who had spent his whole life making sure nothing could touch him unless he allowed it. Cade stood near the towering living room window, one hand in his pocket, staring into the blizzard with the detached stillness of someone who had long ago mistaken solitude for peace. Then he heard it. 3 small knocks. Not pounding, not frantic. Careful, almost polite. He frowned and crossed the marble floor, the echo of his footsteps following him through the silent foyer. When he opened the door, the wind lunged inside, violent and freezing, throwing snow across the polished entryway. And there they were. 2 little girls, both no older than 5, trembling on the threshold, like creatures the storm had nearly swallowed. One stood half a step in front of the other, shielding her sister with her own tiny body. Her dark blonde curls were soaked, her pink sweater too thin for the cold, her boots cracked and iced over. The other girl was smaller in the way sickness can make a child look smaller. Her cheeks flushed, her breathing shaky, her little cough lost beneath the roar of the wind. The first girl lifted her eyes to Cade. They were exhausted in a way no child's eyes should ever be. She tightened her grip on her sister's hand and whispered, "Please, just one night. She's so cold." In that instant, the house behind Cade stopped being a fortress. It became a choice. Cade did not answer right away. For one suspended heartbeat, he simply looked at them. The storm raging behind their small bodies, snow gathering at their feet, like the night itself was trying to drag them back. His instincts, sharpened by years of hard decisions and careful distance, warned him not to get involved. Trouble rarely arrived alone. But then the weaker twin coughed again, a wet, fragile sound that didn't belong in a doorway at 2 a.m. The girl in front of her moved immediately, rubbing her sister's back in small practiced circles, murmuring something soft and urgent under her breath. That was what undid him. Not the cold, not the pleading. The instinctive tenderness of one 5-year-old trying to keep another alive. Without a word, Cade stepped forward, removed the heavy wool coat from his own shoulders, and wrapped it around both girls, covering the coughing one first. The older-feeling twin flinched, as though kindness itself might be a trick, but she did not pull away. Cade moved aside from the doorway. "Come in," he said quietly. The girls hesitated before stepping over the threshold, not like children entering safety, but like children entering somewhere they were not sure they were allowed to survive. The stronger twin never let go of her sister's hand. Inside the foyer, the heat touched their faces, but neither relaxed. Water dripped from their sleeves onto the marble floor. Cade asked their names. The girl with the steadier eyes swallowed before answering. "Elodie," she said. Then she looked down at the pale child beside her. "This is Ivy." Cade asked where their parents were, and in that instant Elodie's face went still in a way that was far too old. "We can leave in the morning," she whispered instead. "We won't touch anything." The line struck Cade harder than any tears would have. These were not children asking for comfort. These were children already preparing to be unwanted again. Cade led the twins into the living room, where the fire had burned down to a bed of red coals, and the enormous space felt strangely ashamed of its own luxury. The room had been designed for entertaining, for admiration, for expensive quiet. But tonight it seemed too large, too empty, too aware of the two drenched children sitting carefully on the edge of a cream-colored couch, as though they were afraid of leaving fingerprints on wealth. Elodie guided Ivy down first, then tucked the borrowed coat tighter around her sister's tiny body before taking a seat beside her. Ivy leaned against Elodie at once, exhausted, and fever-warm, her lashes damp with melted snow. Cade brought towels, warm milk, and a bowl of soup from the kitchen. Elodie thanked him in a voice so careful it sounded rehearsed. She fed Ivy, first breaking bread into tiny pieces and cooling each spoonful before letting her sister swallow. Only after Ivy had eaten a few bites did Elodie touch her own soup. Cade watched quietly from the chair across from them. He noticed how Elodie scanned the room without seeming to keeping track of doorways, windows, shadows. He noticed how Ivy's hand stayed locked in Elodie's sweater, even half asleep. He noticed that neither girl looked around in wonder. No curiosity, no amazement, no childish distraction, just vigilance. The kind children learned when safety had conditions. Later, after he dimmed the lamps and left a blanket near the couch, Cade paused in the darkened hallway outside the living room. He hadn't meant to listen, but the house carried sound too easily. Elodie's whisper drifted through the silence, soft and shaking, as she brushed Ivy's hair back from her hot forehead. "I won't let them split us up," she murmured. A pause. Then, with a fierceness that made Cade go still in the dark, "Not again." Outside, the blizzard clawed at the windows. Inside, the mansion held its breath, as if for the first time in years it understood what had just entered its walls. Morning arrived slowly over Aspen Ridge, pale gray light filtering through the tall windows of Cade Mercer's mansion. The storm had not completely passed, but the wind had softened into restless sighs across the snow-covered hills. Inside the house, warmth drifted quietly through the halls, yet the living room still felt fragile, as though the night's unexpected visitors might disappear if anyone moved too quickly. Cade stepped into the room and found Elodie already awake. She sat cross-legged on the couch, with Ivy's head resting in her lap, gently stroking her sister's damp curls. Ivy's cheeks were flushed far too deeply for comfort. When Cade approached, Elodie instantly tried to sit straighter, as if preparing to defend herself from blame. "She's just tired," she said quickly, her voice too careful to be convincing. Cade knelt and pressed the back of his hand against Ivy's forehead. The heat startled him, for assume strong. "How long?" he asked softly. Elodie lowered her eyes. "Since yesterday." The words felt heavy in the quiet room. Slowly she began explaining in hesitant fragments. Their father had died 6 weeks earlier, and the court had placed them under the guardianship of their aunt, by marriage, Vanessa Hale. At first, Vanessa smiled for neighbors and teachers, but inside the house her patience thinned quickly. The girls were told not to cry, not to make noise, not to be too much. When Ivy's cough worsened, Vanessa grew angry. Yesterday afternoon, after another argument about medicine and mess, she dragged both girls to the door. "Go outside until you learn to behave," she had snapped. Elodie's voice trembled slightly as she finished. She said, "We make everything harder." Cade listened in stunned silence. Then Elodie added the quietest sentence of all, staring at Ivy's face. "If people come, they'll split us up again." In that moment, Cade realized the girls had not simply escaped the storm. They had escaped something colder. When Cade said Ivy needed a doctor, Elodie reacted instantly. Her arms tightened around her sister, as if someone had just tried to pull Ivy away. "No hospitals," she blurted, shaking her head. The fear in her voice was sharp and absolute. Cade paused, careful not to move too suddenly. "Elodie," he said gently, "her fever is very high." But Elodie only held Ivy closer. Her small body trembled, though she tried to look brave. "Hospitals call people," she whispered. The sentence came out with the quiet certainty of a child who had learned something the hard way. Cade crouched so they were eye level. "What people?" Elodie hesitated, staring down at Ivy's face. "The ones who take kids," she murmured. Slowly the story spilled out. After their mother disappeared years ago, social workers had temporarily placed the twins in separate foster homes while paperwork was processed. It had only lasted a week, but for 5-year-old children, it felt like forever. Ivy had cried until she couldn't breathe. Elodie had begged strangers to let her see her sister. Since then, the threat of separation had haunted them like a shadow. Elodie lifted her eyes toward Cade, desperate and exhausted. "If they take her again, she'll think I left her." The words struck him harder than anything else she had said. Cade took a slow breath before answering. "If we don't help her fever, she could get much worse." Ivy coughed weakly in Elodie's arms, her breathing thin and uneven. That sound broke the stalemate. Elodie closed her eyes for a moment, gathering courage far beyond her years. When she opened them again, she nodded once. "Okay," she whispered. Cade grabbed his keys and a thick blanket from the hallway closet. Outside, the storm had begun to fade, but as he opened the front door, he noticed something unsettling: faint tire tracks on the snowy road beyond the gate. Someone had been watching. The road down the mountain curved through towering pine trees buried under heavy snow. Cade's SUV cut carefully through the icy turns, headlights glowing against drifting flakes that still fell lazily from the sky. Inside the car, the heater hummed softly, but Elodie remained wrapped tightly around Ivy in the passenger seat. She kept whispering to her sister in a quiet rhythm, the same 2 words repeated again and again. "You're okay." Ivy leaned weakly against her shoulder, her breathing uneven, her small hands gripping the edge of Cade's coat. Cade drove faster than he normally would on mountain roads, though every movement remained controlled. The storm might be fading, but danger had not entirely passed. In the rearview mirror, he thought he saw headlights once far behind them on the narrow road, but when he looked again, the lights vanished into the gray haze of snow. Elodie noticed the glance. "Is someone there?" she asked softly. Cade kept his voice calm. "Probably another car." But he memorized the direction anyway. Experience had taught him that trouble rarely traveled alone. A few minutes later, the glowing sign of St. Agnes Medical Center appeared ahead, through the snow, bright and unavoidable. The moment Elodie saw the hospital entrance, her body stiffened. Hospitals were not just buildings to her. They were places where adults made decisions that children could not undo. Cade pulled beneath the emergency canopy and stepped out into the cold air. When he opened the passenger door, Elodie didn't move at first. She stared at the automatic sliding doors as if they might swallow her whole. Then Ivy coughed again, weak and exhausted. That was enough. Elodie climbed out, still holding her sister tightly. Together they walked inside the bright emergency room lights, unaware that somewhere across town, a woman named Vanessa Hale had already discovered the girls were gone, and she was furious. The emergency room smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee, the bright fluorescent lights making everything feel too sharp, too real. Nurses moved quickly around Ivy's small hospital bed, placing a thermometer under her tongue, checking oxygen levels, listening carefully to her lungs. Elodie stood beside the bed, like a tiny guard refusing to move more than a few inches away from her sister. Cade remained close, one quiet presence in the room that seemed suddenly full of strangers. When the thermometer beeped, the nurse frowned slightly. 104, she murmured. The number hung in the air like a warning. Elodie's face turned pale. "She's just cold," she said quickly, almost apologetically. But the nurse only gave a gentle smile and continued her work. "We're going to help her," she said softly. Moments later, another woman entered the room carrying a slim clipboard and wearing the calm, practiced expression of someone used to walking into complicated situations. "Good morning," she said kindly. "My name is Tessa Vale." Cade recognized the tone immediately. Child Protective Services. Elodie noticed the badge too, and her entire body stiffened. She instinctively reached for Ivy's hand, gripping it tightly. Tessa crouched slightly, so she wouldn't tower over the girls. "We just need to understand what happened," she explained gently. Cade answered the initial questions, names, ages, how he had found them. Elodie remained silent, her eyes never leaving Ivy's face. Then the nurse stepped closer to Cade and whispered something. Someone had called the hospital, asking about the twins. Tessa's phone buzzed almost at the same moment. She glanced down at the screen, and her expression changed slightly. A woman named Vanessa Hale reported 2 children missing early this morning, she said carefully. Elodie's fingers tightened around the hospital rail. Her voice barely made a sound when she whispered, "She found us." Cade felt the shift immediately. This situation had just crossed a line from concern into conflict. Vanessa Hale arrived at the hospital less than 40 minutes later. She entered the emergency department wrapped in a pristine wool coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the lingering snow outside. Anyone seeing her for the first time might have mistaken her for a grieving relative who had spent the night desperately searching for 2 lost children. Her voice trembled when she spoke to the receptionist. "My nieces," she said softly. "They disappeared last night." The performance was flawless. Tears shimmered just enough in her eyes to look genuine without smearing her makeup. A small crowd of curious hospital staff gathered quietly nearby. Tessa Vale watched carefully from across the hallway. Vanessa clutched a folder containing legal guardianship papers, presenting them like proof of her devotion. When she finally stepped toward the hospital room, she slowed dramatically, as though bracing herself for an emotional reunion. But the moment Elodie saw her through the glass door, the little girl recoiled. Her body shrank backward against the bed, pulling Ivy closer. That reaction was not confusion. It was pure fear. Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered it. "Sweetheart," she cooed gently. "You scared me so much." Cade stepped slightly forward without realizing he had moved. Vanessa's eyes flicked to him immediately, her gaze sharpening. In that brief glance, Cade saw something cold beneath the soft expression she showed everyone else. Calculation. Resentment. She turned back to Tessa with a wounded sigh. "I'm just grateful they're safe," she said. "Children can be dramatic after a loss." Tessa didn't answer right away. She had spent years working with families, and she knew that the first story told was rarely the complete one. Meanwhile, outside the hospital entrance, the first local reporter had already begun asking questions. Within hours, the situation would no longer belong only to the people inside this room. By late afternoon, the story had already begun spreading across Aspen Ridge. A single headline appeared on a local news site, then another. "Millionaire shelters missing twins after blizzard incident." Cameras started appearing near the hospital entrance, reporters speaking into microphones as snow melted along the sidewalks. Inside the hospital room, however, the tension felt heavier and quieter. Ivy slept under a warm blanket while an IV drip slowly lowered her fever. Elodie sat beside the bed, holding her sister's fingers, as if letting go might cause something terrible to happen again. Cade stood near the window, watching the parking lot fill with unfamiliar vehicles. Tessa Vale leaned against the counter, reviewing the information she had gathered so far. Vanessa had filed a missing person report, claiming the girls had wandered off during the storm. Legally, she was still their guardian. That fact complicated everything. The door opened, and a tall woman stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase and a calm expression that suggested she had already read every detail of the situation. Sloane Barrett, she introduced herself, Cade's attorney. Her presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. Sloane greeted Tessa politely, then spoke quietly with Cade near the door. "Right now, the law favors the guardian," she explained in a low voice. "But the circumstances matter. Exposure during a blizzard, medical, neglect the children's statements. Those things change how a judge sees a case." Cade glanced toward Elodie and Ivy. "What do we need?" he asked. Sloane closed her briefcase with a soft click. "Evidence," she said simply. Across the room, Elodie looked up at Cade with the fragile seriousness only frightened children possess. "Are they going to make us go back?" she asked. Cade met her eyes. For the first time since opening his door the night before, he realized something important. Helping the girls had been the easy part. Protecting them would be the real fight. Night settled slowly over St. Agnes Medical Center, turning the hospital windows into mirrors reflecting long, fluorescent hallways and tired faces. Ivy finally slept beneath a warm blanket, her breathing softer now as the fever medication began doing its work. Elodie refused to leave the chair beside the bed. Even when exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, she kept one small hand wrapped around Ivy's fingers, as if the connection itself kept the world from stealing her sister again. Cade stepped quietly into the hallway, needing a moment away from the weight of the room. The vending machines hummed faintly in the dim corridor, their artificial glow reflecting off the polished floor. He leaned against the wall and stared at nothing in particular. For a long time he said nothing. Then Sloane Barrett approached her heels, making almost no sound as she crossed the hallway. "You look like you've been here before," she said gently. Cade let out a slow breath. "I have," he admitted. Years ago, long before the mansion on the hill or the companies bearing his name, Cade Mercer had been just another kid passed through the foster system. Temporary homes, temporary families, temporary promises. Adults always used words like placement and transition, but to children, those words meant something simpler. Leaving. Again and again. Cade remembered the nights he slept with his shoes beside the bed because he never knew when he might be told to pack. He remembered the quiet trick children learned in those houses: never ask for too much, never make noise, never become difficult. Elodie had that same quiet in her eyes. That was why he recognized it immediately. Sloane studied him carefully. "You know this case could get messy," she said. "The guardian has legal standing." Cade nodded. So did a lot of people who shouldn't have had it. Through the glass window of the hospital room, they could see Elodie leaning over Ivy, whispering softly as she brushed hair away from her sister's face. "Those girls walked through a blizzard," Cade said quietly. "They didn't do that for attention." Sloane followed his gaze. "No," she agreed. Then she closed her briefcase with a soft snap. "Which means if we're going to keep them safe, we need proof strong enough that even a courtroom can't ignore it." The hospital room had grown quiet except for the steady beeping of the monitor beside Ivy's bed. Outside the window, the last traces of the storm drifted across the dark sky like fading ghosts. Elodie had finally fallen asleep with her head resting beside Ivy's arm, her fingers still tangled in her sister's sleeve. Cade sat in a chair nearby watching them both. Children looked different when they slept. Younger, smaller. The heavy caution in Elodie's face had softened into something closer to the 5-year-old she actually was. His phone vibrated suddenly against the table. A message from an unknown number. Cade frowned and opened it. "Give them back." A second message appeared seconds later. "You don't know what they cost me." Cade's jaw tightened. He didn't need to guess who had sent it. Across the room, Sloane glanced up immediately when she saw his expression. He handed her the phone without speaking. She read the message once, then again. "Good," she said calmly. Cade blinked in surprise. "Good," Sloane nodded. "Threats are mistakes. They create records." She forwarded the messages to her own phone and began typing quickly. "We'll preserve the metadata. If it leads back to Vanessa, it becomes evidence of intimidation." At the same moment, Tessa Vale stepped quietly into the room holding a tablet. "I just received a call," she said. "A neighbor from Vanessa Hale's street might have something useful." Sloane's attention sharpened instantly. "Security camera," Tessa nodded. "Doorbell footage from the night of the storm." Cade felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time since the girls had appeared on his doorstep, the situation was moving away from speculation and toward something solid. But across the room, Elodie stirred in her sleep, murmuring Ivy's name softly, as if even dreaming she feared losing her. Cade watched the twins for a long moment. "If that video shows what we think it shows," he said quietly, "this entire story changes." Sloane met his eyes. "Exactly," she replied. "And tomorrow morning a judge will see it." The neighborhood where Vanessa Hale lived looked peaceful beneath the fading snow. Small houses lined the quiet street, their driveways buried beneath white drifts left behind by the storm. But peace was deceptive. Two investigators hired by Sloane Barrett walked slowly along the sidewalk, checking addresses against the note Tessa had given them. Finally, they stopped at a modest brick house with a small security camera mounted beside the front door. When the door opened, a thin elderly man appeared wrapped in a heavy sweater and holding a mug of coffee. "Mr. Walter Boone," one investigator asked. The old man nodded cautiously. They showed him a still image on the tablet, two small girls standing in the snow, one holding the other's hand. Walter Boone's face changed instantly. "I remember them," he whispered. The investigators said nothing, waiting. Walter's shoulders sagged as he leaned against the doorframe. "It was that night," he said slowly. "The storm." His voice grew quieter with each word. He explained that he had been watching television when he heard the wind slamming something outside. When he looked through the window, he saw the twins standing on the porch across the street. The front door behind them had just closed. "The little one was coughing," Walter murmured. "Bad." The investigators slid the tablet toward him again. This time, the screen showed video from his neighbor's doorbell camera. The footage flickered slightly in the snowy darkness. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, speaking sharply to the girls. Then, unmistakably, she shoved them forward and slammed the door shut. The video ended with the twins standing alone in the swirling snow. Walter stared at the screen for a long time. "I closed my curtains," he admitted quietly. "I told myself it wasn't my business." He rubbed his face slowly, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. But that little girl, the one holding the other. She kept rubbing her sister's hands to keep them warm. The investigator looked at him carefully. "Mr. Boone," he said gently, "there's a hearing tomorrow morning." Walter nodded, once his voice rough. "Then I guess it's time I stopped pretending I didn't see anything." Family court rarely looked the way people imagined it. There were no dramatic shadows, no echoing speeches, no sudden bursts of applause like in television dramas. Instead, the courtroom in Aspen Ridge's municipal building felt small, quiet, and painfully ordinary. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly above rows of wooden benches. A single American flag stood beside the judge's seat. Papers shuffled softly as attorneys arranged files across their tables. Yet within that plain room, lives were about to change. Cade Mercer sat beside his attorney, Sloane Barrett, at the front of the courtroom. His posture was calm, but the stillness in his shoulders carried the tension of a man who knew the stakes were far higher than money or reputation. Behind him, seated beside CPS caseworker Tessa Vale, were the two small girls whose future had brought everyone there. Elodie sat straight-backed on the bench, her fingers wrapped tightly around Ivy's sleeve. Ivy rested quietly beside her, wrapped in a pale blanket from the hospital, her fever finally fading, but her strength not yet returned. Every few seconds, Elodie glanced toward the courtroom door, as if expecting someone to burst through it and pull them apart. Across the aisle sat Vanessa Hale. She looked composed, elegant in a cream-colored coat, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her expression carefully arranged into something that suggested heartbreak rather than anger. Anyone entering the room without context might easily believe she was a loving guardian fighting to reclaim children from a misunderstanding. Her lawyer, Grant Hollis, stood confidently beside her, flipping through neatly organized documents. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Miriam Holloway entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled neatly back and eyes that carried the quiet patience of someone who had spent decades listening to complicated human stories. She took her seat. "Be seated." Chairs scraped softly as the room settled. Judge Holloway reviewed the file in front of her briefly before speaking. "This hearing concerns the temporary guardianship of minors Elodie Wren and Ivy Wren," she said calmly. "Counselors, you may begin." Grant Hollis rose first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client, Vanessa Hale, has been the lawful guardian of these children since the death of their father earlier this year. Unfortunately, these children were removed from her care under highly questionable circumstances by a private citizen with no legal relationship to them." He gestured toward Cade. "My client reported the girls missing during a severe winter storm. She was shocked to discover they were being held at Mr. Mercer's residence." Vanessa lowered her head slightly, her voice trembling just enough when she spoke. "I just want my nieces safe," she said softly. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The performance was convincing. Sloane Barrett rose slowly. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "before this court considers guardianship, it is necessary to examine the circumstances that caused two 5-year-old children to walk through a blizzard rather than remain in Miss Hale's home." She turned toward the clerk. "We would like to submit video evidence." Across the courtroom, Vanessa's composed expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Something in the air shifted. The truth was about to enter the room. Grant Hollis moved quickly to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," he said, "before addressing any alleged evidence, my client would like the opportunity to clarify what happened that night." Judge Holloway nodded once. "Proceed." Vanessa Hale stood slowly. Her movements were careful, controlled, almost delicate, as if the weight of the situation had exhausted her. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet tremor of someone describing a painful memory. "The girls have had a difficult year," she said. "Their father passed away unexpectedly. I stepped in because they had nowhere else to go." She paused, pressing a tissue gently to the corner of her eye. "I've done everything I could to care for them." Grant nodded sympathetically beside her. Vanessa continued. "That night, Elodie became upset. She's always been protective of Ivy, sometimes overly so. When Ivy began coughing again, Elodie panicked and ran out of the house. I tried to stop them, but by the time I realized they were gone, the storm had already started." The story was calm, believable, carefully shaped. Across the courtroom, Elodie stiffened. She didn't speak, but her small fingers tightened around Ivy's sleeve. Grant turned toward the judge. "Children can be emotional after trauma," he said smoothly. "Unfortunately, Mr. Mercer's involvement has complicated a private family matter." He glanced briefly toward Cade. "A wealthy stranger inserting himself into a grieving family's situation can create misunderstandings." Cade didn't react, but Sloane Barrett watched Vanessa carefully, noting every pause, every carefully chosen word. When Grant finished, the courtroom fell quiet. Judge Holloway nodded toward Sloane. "Your response?" Sloane stepped forward slowly. "Your Honor," she said, "we agree the girls experienced trauma." She paused deliberately. "But the source of that trauma is precisely what we intend to clarify." She turned toward the clerk. "Please display the video." The courtroom monitor flickered to life. At first the footage looked grainy and indistinct, a snowy porch illuminated by a dim outdoor light. Wind pushed white streaks across the screen. Then the front door opened. Vanessa appeared in the frame. Behind her stood two tiny figures bundled in coats, Elodie and Ivy. The courtroom fell completely silent. On the screen, Vanessa's arm moved sharply. The smaller girl stumbled forward into the snow. The door slammed shut. The video ended. No music, no commentary, just the brutal simplicity of what had happened. For a moment, no one spoke. Grant Hollis stood motionless beside his client. Across the room, Vanessa's composure cracked for the first time. "That footage lacks context," Grant said quickly. But the words sounded weaker now. Sloane didn't respond immediately. Instead, she said quietly, "Perhaps testimony will provide it." She turned toward the courtroom door. "Call Walter Boone." Walter Boone walked slowly to the witness stand, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath a thick winter coat. He looked like a man who had not slept well in several days. The bailiff swore him in. Walter sat down, gripping the edge of the wooden chair with both hands. Sloane approached gently. "Mr. Boone," she began. "Where do you live across the street from Miss Hale?" he replied quietly. "Do you recognize the children in the video we just viewed?" Walter nodded. "Yes." His voice carried the weight of something unresolved. Sloane continued. "Where were you on the night of the storm? "In my living room," he said. "Watching television." "What drew your attention outside?" Walter swallowed. The wind was loud. Something hit the porch light across the street. He paused briefly. "So I looked out the window." The courtroom remained silent. "What did you see?" Sloane asked. Walter looked down at his hands. "I saw those girls standing outside." His voice trembled slightly now. It was snowing hard. Real hard. Sloane let the silence stretch for a moment before asking the next question. "What did you do?" Walter's shoulders sagged. "I closed my curtains." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Sloane didn't press. Instead, she asked softly, why Walter exhaled slowly. "I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked up, then his eyes tired, but I kept thinking about them. He turned slightly toward the bench where Elodie and Ivy sat. The little one was coughing. Elodie's grip tightened around Ivy. Walter continued. The other girl kept rubbing her hands to warm them. He paused again. "I should have helped." The words echoed softly in the room. Sloane nodded. "Did you eventually see them leave?" "Yes." "How they walked down the street together," Walter said quietly, holding hands. The courtroom remained still. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." Walter nodded once, then stepped down. Across the room, Vanessa suddenly shifted in her chair. Her calm expression had begun to unravel. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Grant immediately placed a hand on her arm. "Vanessa." But it was too late. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Ms. Hale," she said firmly, "you will remain silent unless addressed." The room grew quiet again. Then Sloane Barrett stood once more. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we have one final piece of testimony." She glanced toward the bench behind her. From someone who lived through that night. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the small figure sitting beside Ivy. Elodie. The courtroom door closed softly behind Elodie as she walked toward the witness stand. The movement was slow, careful, the way a child approaches something uncertain. She was so small that the chair looked oversized when she climbed into it. The clerk gently handed her a small stuffed bear so she wouldn't feel alone. Elodie held it quietly. Across the courtroom, Ivy watched with wide, worried eyes. Judge Holloway softened her voice slightly. "Hello, Elodie," she said kindly. "Do you know why you're here?" Elodie nodded once. "To tell the truth." The judge gave a small, approving nod. Sloane Barrett stepped forward slowly, careful not to overwhelm the child. "Elodie," she said gently, "can you tell the court what happened the night of the storm?" Elodie took a breath. Her voice was soft but clear. "Aunt Vanessa was mad," she said. Why, Sloane asked. Because Ivy was coughing again. She paused, glancing toward her sister before continuing. "She said we were making everything harder." The room remained completely still. "What happened next?" Sloane asked. Elodie's fingers tightened around the stuffed bear. "She opened the door and told us to go outside." "Did she say when you could come back in?" Elodie shook her head slowly. "She said, maybe when we learned how to behave." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom before the judge raised her hand for silence. Sloane continued gently, "Why didn't you go to the police?" Elodie looked down for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because last time people came, they took Ivy away. Several people in the courtroom shifted. Sloane's voice remained calm. Can you explain what you mean? Elodie nodded slowly. When our mom disappeared, people took us to different houses for a little while. Her voice trembled slightly. Ivy cried every night. She looked up toward the judge. I thought she thought I left her. The room grew heavy with silence. Then Elodie added the sentence that changed everything. If we didn't find somewhere warm, she might have gone to sleep in the snow. Her small voice cracked, and I didn't know how to wake her up. Cade lowered his eyes. Across the room, Vanessa Hale muttered sharply under her breath. Oh, for God's sake. The judge heard it. Everyone did. Judge Holloway's expression hardened slightly, but Elodie wasn't finished. She looked toward Cade for a moment before speaking again. We knocked on his door, she said softly. And he didn't close it. After Elodie stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained silent for several long seconds. No one seemed eager to break the weight of what had just been said. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. Counsel, she said calmly. Do you have additional testimony? Sloane Barrett stood once more. Yes, Your Honor. She approached the center of the courtroom again, turning her attention toward Vanessa Hale. Ms. Hale, Sloane said evenly. You testified earlier that the children ran away during an argument. Vanessa lifted her chin. Yes, and you stated you attempted to stop them. That's correct. Sloane nodded slowly. Then she opened a file and held up a printed document. Would you like to explain why in a text message sent 2 days earlier you wrote the following? She read the words aloud. 2 kids are more trouble than sympathy. Vanessa's expression tightened. That message was taken out of context, she said quickly. Sloane tilted her head slightly. What context would make that statement appropriate when referring to 2 5-year-old girls under your guardianship? Vanessa's composure began to crack. You don't understand what it's like, she snapped. Raising children is difficult. Sloane's tone remained steady. Many people raise children without locking them outside in a blizzard. Vanessa's voice rose sharply. I didn't lock them outside. Sloane held up the image from the doorbell camera again. Then perhaps the video is mistaken. The courtroom monitor displayed the footage once more. Vanessa looked at the screen. For a moment she said nothing. Then frustration exploded out of her. You think I wanted them? She shouted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Vanessa stood abruptly. Do you have any idea what it's like living with 2 crying, coughing little problems every day? Her lawyer grabbed her arm. Vanessa, stop, but it was too late. I didn't ask for them, she continued angrily. Judge Holloway raised her voice. Ms. Hale, that will be enough. 2 court officers stepped forward immediately. Vanessa froze. The damage had already been done. Across the room, Elodie sat beside Ivy, her face pale but calm. For the first time since the hearing began, she no longer looked afraid. She looked certain. Judge Holloway turned toward the bench again. The court has heard enough. The courtroom felt impossibly quiet as Judge Holloway reviewed the documents before her. Pages turned slowly. Pens scratched softly across paper. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Elodie sat beside Ivy with her arm wrapped protectively around her sister's shoulders. Ivy leaned against her, still weak but awake now, watching the adults with cautious curiosity. Cade remained seated at the front of the courtroom. He had built companies worth millions. He had negotiated contracts that determined the fate of hundreds of employees. Yet none of those moments had felt as heavy as the silence in this room. Finally, Judge Holloway looked up. Her voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably firm. This court finds that the minors, Elodie Wren and Ivy Wren, were placed in immediate physical danger, while under the guardianship of Vanessa Hale. Vanessa stiffened in her chair. Judge Holloway continued. The court also finds credible evidence that Ms. Hale misrepresented the events leading to the children leaving her residence. Vanessa's attorney lowered his head slightly. Based on the video evidence, witness testimony, and medical reports from St. Agnes Medical Center, this matter will be referred for investigation into potential child endangerment and neglect. Two court officers stepped closer to Vanessa. She looked around the courtroom, stunned. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Judge Holloway ignored the protest and turned toward Cade Mercer. "Mr. Mercer." Cade stood immediately. "Yes, Your Honor. Given the medical circumstances, the testimony presented, and the expressed fear of the children regarding their previous guardian, this court is granting you temporary protective guardianship, pending further review." A quiet gasp escaped Elodie. Judge Holloway's expression softened slightly as she looked toward the girls. "Young ladies," she said gently, "no one will separate you today." For a moment, Elodie didn't move. Then her shoulders shook as tears rolled down her cheeks. Ivy clung to her arm. Across the courtroom, Cade stepped closer and knelt in front of them. Elodie wiped her face quickly and looked at him. "For real," she whispered. Cade nodded. "For real." Outside the courthouse, the winter sun finally broke through the clouds. But inside the courtroom, the storm that had begun the night before had finally ended. The mansion on the hill had never been designed for children. For years, it had been a place of quiet efficiency, wide hallways, polished floors, expensive furniture that no one ever used for long. The silence had once felt comfortable to Cade Mercer. Predictable. Safe. But silence changes when children arrive. 3 days after the court hearing, the house sounded different. It began with small things, tiny footsteps echoing down the hallway at 7 in the morning, the soft clatter of a spoon against a cereal bowl, a 5-year-old voice whispering to another 5-year-old voice from the kitchen table. Cade stood at the counter pouring orange juice when he noticed something he had never seen before in his home. 2 small backpacks resting against the wall near the door. Elodie sat carefully at the table, helping Ivy hold her spoon steady while she ate. "Slow," Elodie reminded gently. "I know," Ivy murmured. Cade watched the moment quietly. The girls had only been in the house a few days yet. Elodie still behaved like someone who believed every kindness had an expiration date. She cleaned every plate she used. She folded every blanket she touched. She apologized whenever she asked for anything. That afternoon, while Ivy rested on the couch, Elodie wandered slowly through the living room. Not touching anything, just looking. Like someone studying a place she didn't yet believe belonged to her. Then it happened. Her foot caught the edge of the rug. The glass bowl sitting on the table beside her slid forward and crashed onto the marble floor. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Elodie froze. Her entire body went still, waiting. Cade walked into the room. For a moment, he looked at the broken glass scattered across the floor. Then he looked at her hands. "Did it cut you?" he asked calmly. Elodie blinked. The question confused her. I broke it," she whispered. Cade crouched down and gently checked her fingers. They were shaking but unharmed. "It's just a bowl," he said quietly. Her eyes filled instantly with tears, not because the bowl broke, but because she hadn't been yelled at. For the first time in a long time, Elodie realized something strange about this house. Mistakes didn't feel dangerous here, and that was a kind of safety she had never known. Spring arrived slowly in Aspen Ridge. Snow melted from the mountains in quiet streams, and the air began to smell like pine instead of ice. Inside the Mercer estate, life had begun settling into a rhythm that once would have seemed impossible. Ivy's cough had faded. Her laughter had returned, first bright, sudden bursts of joy that echoed through the kitchen whenever Cade tried to flip pancakes on Sunday mornings. Elodie changed more slowly. Children who had learned to survive before they learned to relax did not transform overnight. But the changes were there. She slept through the night more often. She stopped apologizing for asking for a second glass of milk. Sometimes she even forgot to check twice that Ivy was still beside her. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Cade sat on the back porch while the twins played with chalk along the stone patio. Bright drawings covered the ground, stick houses, smiling suns, crooked flowers. Ivy ran inside to grab more chalk. Elodie remained behind. She approached Cade quietly and climbed onto the chair beside him. "Can I ask something?" she said. "Of course." She looked down at her hands. "If I mess up someday." Her voice grew smaller. "Will you send me away?" The question landed like a weight in the air. Cade felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard that fear before. In foster homes, in group shelters, in the quiet voices of children who had learned that love often came with conditions. He turned toward her. "Elodie," he said gently, "you're not here because you've been perfect." She looked up. "You're here because you belong here." Her eyes searched his face carefully. Still unsure, still learning. Cade continued. "There's nothing small, loud, messy, or difficult that will make me stop choosing you." Elodie didn't answer right away, but she leaned against his shoulder for the first time since arriving at the house. And sometimes, for children like her, that small movement meant more than words ever could. 6 months later, the courthouse felt very different. This time, there were no reporters outside, no tense whispers, no accusations, just quiet paperwork and a judge who had seen enough of the case to understand what truly mattered. Judge Miriam Holloway looked down at the final documents resting on her desk. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." After reviewing the completed home evaluations and CPS reports, the court approves the adoption petition. She signed the final page. 2 names were written clearly across the document. Elodie Mercer, Ivy Mercer. Across the room, Ivy swung her legs happily from the bench. Elodie held the paper with careful hands, reading the new last name again, as if it might disappear if she blinked too quickly. Outside the courthouse, sunlight spilled across the wide stone steps. Spring had fully arrived. Ivy twirled in circles while Cade spoke briefly with Sloane and Tessa. Elodie stood nearby, still studying the document. Finally, she walked over to Cade. "Can I ask something?" she said. He smiled slightly. "You can always ask something." She looked up at him. "Can I call this home forever now?" For a moment, Cade didn't answer. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because the question carried the weight of everything that had happened since that night in the storm. He knelt so they were eye level. "It was home the moment you knocked on the door," he said softly. Elodie nodded slowly. That night, the house on the hill glowed warmly against the dark mountains. Inside, Ivy had fallen asleep on the couch, while Elodie colored quietly beside her. Cade stepped outside onto the porch. He reached up and turned on the light above the front door. The soft yellow glow spilled across the snow-dusted steps. He left it on, not because the house needed light, but because somewhere out in the world, another child might one day need a door that stayed open long enough to change everything. And now Cade Mercer understood something he had once forgotten. Sometimes the smallest knock was the beginning of a family. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.